Okay, it's about time, so I want to start welcoming everybody to my talk, Development for All the People. I'm honored to be here this third time in a row talking about different IIS topics. This year I want to start in asking you in the audience, who's excited about accessibility? Who can't wait to implement accessibility when they start a new project? I see a few hands, but most of them I see down. I hope I can use the next 45 minutes to convince you otherwise, and I want to start and set the topic of this talk a little bit with an Apple marketing video that I think does a really good job conveying why we should do accessibility and how it can help different kinds of people.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. This is the station to rock you, shock you, move you, and groove you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. My name is Patrick Lafayette. Don't you ever forget, it's Chris Mix Radio. Patrick with you. To do something for yourself.
Voiceover on Logic Pro X
is one of the greatest things you could ever do.
Record. Menu 10 items. Count in. Submenu. Metronome set. Check mark. Allow quick punch and check mark.
Now, I can express myself.
Camera. Picture 2 in progress. Picture 1 is citrus printed plastic bottle.
It's a big thing when you're a father and you want to participate.
Picture 3 is coffee powder. Picture 3 is personality white audience.
Oh. What's up, man? Not just make food, but make excellent food. Where I see my wife take her shoes off and say, "Give me some more." Dig that. And my kids lick their chops and say, "Daddy, that was great." I have so much that I've always wanted to express. I'm like a volcano. I'm like Pele or Mount Etna.
Are the tracker recording?
Now I'm about ready to erupt.
So I think Apple did a really great job with this video, and sure enough, they went enough time into that. But one thing that stood out for me was the design for everyone, and I had to watch the video over and over again and actually like Google Patrick, like what his disabilities are. And while the video might show that he's blind and that he still takes part in everyday life, it is impressive to me to see that there is the difference between him who has impairments and someone who doesn't have impairments can be relatively small given the right accessibility technologies. And that's why we're here today. We want to talk about development for all the people, inclusive design, but also development for all the people as in no longer inclusive all. So I'm an iOS developer, and I've been an iOS developer for the past 5 years. And in one of my last jobs, I've been working for a relatively reputable US AC company that has been going into the IoT field. So what I was doing was writing their backend and their front end, so people could control their water heaters and their ACs with their iPhones. And one day I got this review in on the Apple App Store that basically said, for the first time in my life I can control the AC myself, thanks for making the app accessible. Here I was not knowing why I made an app accessible, but apparently got a great review, and I was wondering, how the fuck did I do that? Apologies for the language, but this is really what went through my head. All I was really doing was setting labels and identifiers so I could better debug a UI hierarchy, but apparently that did it already. So here I was trying to look at how I can justify some more time into spending and how to make an app accessible, even though I don't know what the user group is behind that, and even though my boss wasn't too eager to give me time on looking into this field. So what I did is what most people in the audience probably would do. I was looking up numbers and stats, stuff to satisfy my boss's need for why I need to spend time on these kind of things. So I came across this chart that I think is pretty significant, and that you should take quite some time to look over this. The worldwide internet usage compared to users with accessibility needs in the US. If we look at it, we have the total number of users in China is almost 300 million users. In the US, we're slightly over 225 million users, and if we compared it to the number of users that have deaf and hard of hearing or blind and low vision needs, accessibility needs, the number is quite significant for these two user groups. And remember, like those are just the two user groups within the US. So here I was looking at that, and sure enough, I was wondering, why am I actually spending money and time to make my app that is already relatively good, pixel perfect for the 1% of users, to push them even further into using my app, when I could potentially have a 2-digit number or have a million number of users covered by doing a relatively new technology, or doing a technology that is invisible to everybody else, but I could reach way more than the 1% if making something pixel perfect. So there I was and started my journey, and this is what I want to share with you guys today. And this is what we're going to talk about on the agenda. We're going to talk about the different accessibility needs. You need to understand what are the different needs to actually solve these issues. We're going to look at a few common accessibility problems. You might hear in my accent that I'm not a native speaker. I'm German, so I generally like to complain about things, even though they might be already good or bad. And this is why we're doing the common accessibility problems. I want to bitch about what's on the App Store and what is really, really badly done. But we're also going to see what accessibility technologies, and the third point on my agenda, what accessibility technologies are available, and what I've been complaining before, I want to make better. So we're going to look at concrete examples on how these things could have been made better relatively easy. But how good is it to know how to implement something if you can't test it? That's why we're going to look, and we're going to do that together, on how you can enable accessibility features in your iOS device, and how you can actually put that into your usual QA process. I'm also going to show you great examples of accessibility. There's not only bad examples, there's also really good examples, and I want to show you this too. And at the end of the day, and the conclusion, we're going to look at what to take away from this talk, what are the tests that you can do, and what you should start doing right after. So different accessibility needs. Generally, there's 4 categories of accessibility needs that every impairment would potentially fall under. The first one is the visual impairment. So you could be blind, or you could be colorblind or have low vision. There's the auditory impairment, so you could be deaf or hard of hearing. There's the motor or physical impairment, so if you're bound to a wheelchair or you have some kind of other motor disability. And there's the cognitive impairment. In the cognitive impairment, there's a lot of ranges that fall under this. This is from that it's relatively difficult for you to remember taking a large amount of information, up to ADHD or stuff like, even kids would potentially fall under this as their cognitive, or as they're not potentially permanently impaired, but they have a temporary impairment as they evolve their cognitive sensory. Here in this example, you could be blind, and you could be relying only what you're hearing, what your iPhone on the accessibility feature on VoiceOver is telling you. You could be deaf and only communicate with sign language, and not actually like replying or hearing what your iPhone sounds. You could be bound to a wheelchair and only use a sensor switch, for example, that is on part of your body that you can still move, like a sensor switch, for example, on your head, where you could like control your iPhone through that. Or like I said, the cognitive impairment, where you have learning disabilities, distractibility, or the inability to remember or focus large amounts of information. So we've seen different kinds of accessibility needs. And if we look at this XKCD comic strip, it makes sense for most of us because most of us are perfectly sighted, and we can look at this chart, we can look at the comic strip and actually consume the information. But what if you're blind and you can't? Well, technology has a way to do that, and I want to show you the XKCD accessibility project, or better let you hear it.
Transcript edit. Caption above the diagram. How well something works. After I decide to fix it. The comic shows a graph with a solid curve that decreases in 8 different sized steps from the top left to the bottom right. The x-axis shows time passes and gives the time from 0 to 5 hours with 6 ticks with labels beneath. The y-axis shows how well something works with 8 ticks, but only 4 of them labeled. Works great. Has minor problems. Doesn't work. Will never work again. 0 hours, 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours. The solid line has 6 labels with an arrow pointing to different sections. 2 times the same label has 2 arrows pointing to different sections. The first ellipsis with lines takes a step down, and the second to 2 plateaus on either side of the step. In total, the arrows point 4 times on both steps of plateaus. Both the first and final plateau has a dot has added to the line, and the arrows point to those. Above the solid line, there are 3 dotted lines going up from 3 plateaus just before the solid line takes a step down. The last 2 of these lines split up into, with one going higher. At the end of each of these 5 dotted lines, there is a sentence spoken. The solid line begins at the second tick on the y-axis and finishes at the last. The 3 dotted lines going up ends up at the 1 tick on the y-axis. For the last 2, there are also a line ending at the second tick and third tick respectively. Only the first label being above the first tick on the x-axis, but the last 3 labels are all above the last tick on the x-axis. Here is a list of all the labels in chronological order according to the position on the x-axis. For those that has the same time stamp, the top one will be mentioned first. Those at the end of the line are indented. I start trying to fix it. It just needed cleaning. Take it apart. Fix it. Well, at least it's not more broken than when I started. Take it apart more. Watch YouTube instructional videos. Take a deep breath and cut wires. That was heroic and I deserve the Nobel Prize. Well, it sort of works now. Turn to other possessions, and let that be a lesson to you.
So I think whether your impairment is a visual impairment or an auditory impairment, the XKCD Accessibility Project did a really good job explaining something that is mostly visual to any kind of person with an accessibility needs. And that's what we're gonna look at today, how you can make your app accessible so that whatever information you're trying to convey, you can convey on screen, whether it's visual or auditory. So to master technology, I always feel like you need to understand the issue at first. So I went ahead and looked at what I could find on great accessibility examples. And it turns out Amazon is really, really good at SEO and has a whole site on accessibility needs and how they're supporting people with accessibility needs. And so I found a slide that, unfortunately, it's hard to read, but let me read it for you. It basically says, use the mobile version of Amazon for an optimized screen reader version. Underneath, use the mobile version of Amazon for an experience that helps, or for a simplified experience if you have accessibility needs. So it seemed to me like they're doing a really good job, and you would think that Amazon, a company that has thousands of code literally looking only at the Amazon app on iOS, would have a great implementation. So I went ahead in my journey and looked at it, and I was first auditing the app by looking at the large accessibility text, also known as dynamic font. So on the left-hand side, we see the same app, the same instruction, or the same steps to go into the Amazon app without accessibility needs turned on, or without the dynamic font turned on. On the right-hand side, we see it turned on with accessibility needs. I'm going to play it for you. We already see that the native iOS things are in a larger font. I did an example search for Apple TV, and if you take close attention, or even not close attention, nothing really changed. So for a company of Amazon size that leaves out literally millions of users, that's kind of disappointing, and that's a fail. I did the same thing for VoiceOver, and I just let you experience it.
VoiceOver on Amazon. Echo devices starting at $39.99 vertical line limited time offer. Button. Image. Show navigation menu. Button. Home. Button. Your notifications. Button. Cart. 0. Button. What are you looking for? Search field. Double tap to act. Search field is empty. What? Apple TV in all departments. Button. In progress. Sponsored. Fire TV with 4K Ultra HD and Alexa voice remote. Pendant design. Vertical line streaming media player. Heading. Link. By Amazon. $39.99. $69.99. Dimmed. Prime. Image. Rating. 4.1 out of 5. 20,988. In stock on September 1st, 2018. Apple TV 32 gigabytes. 4th generation. Heading. Link. By Apple. $149.00. Prime. Image. Free delivery by Monday, August 27th. Rating, 4.4 out of 5. 281.
So if you look closer at what Amazon produced here, this is the information that they try to convey. So if you would have closed your eyes while you're hearing this, I think it would have been really, really hard to understand what you're trying to buy, and would have been even more confusing what the correct price was. Because if we looked at the Fire Stick or the Fire TV from Amazon, they had like a strike-through price as well. That was really hard to understand. So the questions here really is like, if you look at the rating that was conveyed to us as rating 4.3 out of 5, like how many reviews make up for that rating? Is it 1 rating, 2 rating, 3 ratings? They kind of had the information here, but what does this number represent? It wasn't really connected to each other. Or, like I said, the strike-through price. If you have several prices, one strike-through price and one real price, or the one price that you would be paying, they didn't make any difference. They didn't mention that one is the strike-through price and the other one isn't. So this is pretty much an epic fail, in my opinion. On the other hand, I was telling you guys about my experience, like developing an IoT solution for ACs. And I'm a big fan myself of the ecobee. So this is the ecobee interface, and it's very, very simple. So I was imagining that the ecobee interface would be fully accessible. So I did the same test here, and I just let you hear it again.
Voiceover on. ecobee. Button. Bedroom. Heading. Cool mode. Button. 50%. 25. 28. Array. Menu. Button. To normal spacing. Button. Quick changes. Button. Cool mode. Button. Heat.
So 25, 28, what? Like what am I controlling? Is one thing the inside temperature, the one side the outside temperature? If you don't have the visual information, like how would you determine which one is which? So I say pretty much failed at that too. And now that we understood what the common problems are and like how hard it is for someone that doesn't see what you're seeing on the screen, I want to at least a lot to desire, at least a lot to like how can we fix this? So we need to understand what are the desires for someone that doesn't see the screen and what information do we need to convey. At my example for the person with a visual impairment, I brought up a YouTuber called Tommy Edison, the blind film critique. He's an hilarious guy on YouTube that like is a film critique for any kind of movie, and he has a session where he's with a person that became blind later in their life, and talking about the desires. And just so you know, so you can emphasize what a desire for someone with accessibility needs is, I want to play you the video too.
What's something that you wish you could do, but you can't because of your blindness?
Driving.
Little boy, you want to talk about that?
Oh, I think it's because I've always loved to drive ever since I started driving when I had vision. It makes me feel very independent. I grew up an only child. I lost my mom when I was young, so being independent was very much a part of me. I loved running errands by myself. I loved just doing a lot of things by myself, using my car as a vehicle. So when I lost my vision, I think that's what I miss most. I used to drive a manual, so I found it fun. Driving was kind of, I wouldn't say a hobby, but it was definitely something I like to pass the time with. It was kind of my alone time. Second most thing I miss is watching foreign films with subtitles.
For me, I would like to catch a ball. I'd like to be able to catch a ball and not have somebody go, all right, Tommy, here it comes. Hands up, get ready. I'd like to just be able to reach up and catch one. You know what I mean? That'd be so cool. I'd like to be able to use the computer without speech. You know what I mean? I'd like to be able to look at the whole screen and see a bunch of stuff all at once and just pop, pop, pop. I mean, sighted people went through the computer so fast it blows my mind.
Yeah.
I'd like to be able to do that.
So we've heard two blind people talking about the desires, and one thing that stands out to me is both independence and both all the problems that they were mentioning are somewhat being able to solve with technology. If we look at Tommy, that he's talking about using a computer without voiceover, or his desire is really to be independent again and using the screen like other people do, because apparently we're doing already a bad job at conveying information with speech, because that's how he uses all these things, and apparently we leave something for desire. If we look at Christina, who became blind later in life, she wants to drive a car again to be independent. And if we look at Tesla with the auto drive feature, for example, this is something that could be potentially a technology in the future. So I want to have you keep this in mind when we're talking about these technologies that already exist. Think a little bit outside the box, what could happen in the future. So when we're talking about accessibility technologies on iOS, there are 31 technologies that Apple lists under accessibility technologies. The green ones in this chart are the ones that you're basically getting for free. Things like guided access or large phone keypads, they come with the operating system. So iOS already gives these to you without any need for you to implement them. The red ones are the ones that are the most important. VoiceOver and dynamic text are the one that you as the app developers have to implement to make your app more accessible. And those are the ones that we also want to talk about the most today. So how does VoiceOver and dynamic text actually work? So they both work by using the UI accessibility protocol, which is the protocol that is already implemented for you in all the UI kit controls. So if a user uses VoiceOver, what really happens is that VoiceOver is using the accessibility protocol, or better said, the implementation of the accessibility protocol in the control that VoiceOver is trying to navigate to. So how does the UI accessibility protocol look like? So there are 4 properties that you have to set. The first one is accessibility element, which declares if an element is accessible. This is only in Boolean, so you only have to set it true or false. The second one, and the most important one, after you've set it to an accessibility element, is the accessibility label, which summarizes what the accessibility element does, or what kind of information you're trying to convey with it. The third one is the accessibility hint. It tells you what the action will trigger. For example, music will play. The accessibility hint can be turned off by the accessibility user, so sometimes those people don't use it. And the third one is the accessibility traits, a relatively new feature in accessibility that characterizes an accessibility element. For example, in the sample that I was giving you on the ecobee slider, that would have been an adjustable slider. If you set it to the correct integer mask, for example, adjustable in this case, it will, iOS will automatically give you information and automatically will convey the information what the UI element does to the user. So if we look at this example again, the epic fail on ecobee, how could we make this better? Well, it is relatively easy. I re-implemented the ecobee interface as it's all a few labels and a few buttons, so it should be relatively easy, and it really is. If we look at that, we only have to set a label, as I mentioned before. We have to set an accessibility value in this case, because we have a slider and we want to attach a value or a unit to the value that we are representing. We have to set a trait. As I said before, the trait is one of the most important parts in that case. And for the slider, we also have to set the hint on what we're actually going to do. And then if you want to have that more dynamic, you can also set it on the slider changed value. How does it look like if we fix that? Well, here it is.
VoiceOver on. Accessibility. Set point temperature. 24.5 degrees Celsius. Adjustable. Change set point temperature. Swipe up or down with one finger to adjust the value. Operating mode. Cooling. Dimmed. Image. Humidity. 52%. Dimmed. Temperature. 24.5 Celsius. Dimmed. Temperature. 24.5 Celsius. Dimmed. Home mode. Dimmed. Button.
So we see there's way more information conveyed at this point. If we started VoiceOver, which I did, the first thing it was pointing us to was how we can change the temperature, the set point temperature. So we actually know that there's something that we can change, and we know it's the temperature that we are changing. It gave us the information on what value is currently the set point set at, and it gave us information on what we can do with the slider. Also, the other buttons were better labeled because we set accessibility labels. And you saw that we did that in 5-6 lines of code, and everything else is interface builder basically putting a value to a name or putting a value to a label. And a blind person is already able to set a set point on a C with only VoiceOver. I think that's pretty impressive. But let's look further. If we remember the example on the Amazon example that I had, how can we make this better? Well, Apple gives us very, very easy tools for that too. There's a protocol called UI Accessibility Container that helps us make custom views or views that exist out of several different views. For example, a label and an image, to put this information together. And all we really would have to do, by the way, Twitter is an excellent app doing that already, would be to set the accessibility container, set the accessibility label for the container, set the container where it is and what the frame looks like, and that is all that we do. And if we do that, that is the information that we would see. I implemented that again, and I will show you in a second what it looks like. But the same thing, Apple has a really easy tutorial on that, delivering an exceptional accessibility experience that I can only recommend, that shows you how easily this can be done, and it's really only a protocol. So the solution would look like this after we implemented that.
VoiceOver on. Accessibility. Apple TV 32 gigabytes. 4th generation. By Apple. It's $149. Prime shipping. With free delivery by Tuesday, August 21st. Rating 4.6 out of 5 across 274 ratings.
So wasn't that much better than we heard before? So this time the person with an impairment was actually able to know what the price is. He was able to know what the rating was, especially the rating had a way better meaning than 4.3 out of 5 across 274 reviews. And for once, the person that's using that didn't have to look at the screen to actually get all this information. So relatively easy up until here. I don't think there's any challenge into that. Especially the only thing we have to do is setting labels at this point. So, but if we want to do a more advanced solution for accessibility users, there's also gesture and custom actions. So once VoiceOver is turned on, we will see this in a minute when we talk about how to test VoiceOver. There are two gestures that should be always supported. There's the two-finger tap, which is called the magic tap. If you tap twice on the screen when you have VoiceOver turned on, the most important state of your app should be triggered by that magic tap. There's also the two-finger C shape, as we will see in a second. If you're just swiping left or right with one finger while VoiceOver is turned on, you don't go one page up, one page down, because you're just scrolling between different labels. So there's the two-finger C shape, which will do the same thing as for us if we swipe left or right for the screen. This is called the Perform Escape, and it comes for free with the UI navigation controller. But if you're presenting something modally, you have to support it by overriding the attribute. There's also the UI accessibility custom action, which you can trigger through either an action rotor or an action menu. And it's relatively easy to implement that. You really only have to create an instance of the class and set it to whatever you want to call with that. Now, I want to note with all of that, use those kind of things frugally or not too much, because gestures and special custom actions have to be learned. And while we relatively fast learn these kind of things, it's not available across all apps. So when you're supported, for example, giving a custom or UI accessibility custom action for the share menu, it is something that you have to support throughout the app, and that might have to be learned first. So this is kind of hard for most accessibility users. The other thing we were talking about is dynamic type. So dynamic type is a technology that came with iOS 7 that you can set your preferred accessibility font size. And this is even easier to do because all you have to do in Interface Builder would be setting automatically adjust font and set a text style to that. If you would do that programmatically, you can call the preferred font function and get a font back that is actually to what the user likes, or to what the user set his liking to. And then if the user ever changes that on iOS 10 plus, so if we have iOS 10 and forward, we can simply set a variable adjust font for content size category, or before iOS 10 we have to listen to the notification UI content size category did change. And from there we only have to look into our interface builder and see, or into our interface and see if we don't have any clipping. And Interface Builder is once again very clever in that. If you set your constraints static to both sides, and you would get into clipping once you have a bigger font size, it will actually warn you and give you a warning that you have a trading constraint is missing, or that your trading constraint is set static, and you should probably consider having it going into a bigger, smaller, or greater than constraint instead of like a static constraint. And if you forgot to set the text style for to support dynamic fonts, like Interface Builder will also tell you that. This is what a warning will look like, and the fix that Interface Builder tells you. And if you're ever in the situation that you're prototyping and you want to see if you're clipping or not, Interface Builder also gives you a great thing here called the double length pseudo language. If you go into Interface Builder, go into the assistant editor on the right, and actually select preview, all your labels will be the double length pseudo language, the extended pseudo language, or the bounded string pseudo language. So you already have like real good tools at hand that come with Xcode that will help you avoid clipping and support dynamic font from today. And further, there's we've seen these 31 technologies that Apple puts on their accessibility page. Each one of those have a certain check that iOS allows you. I pointed out the is bold text here, the is guided access enabled, and the is reduced motion enabled. Many people have issues with different kinds of motion. The parallax effect, for example, is an issue for some people. And it's super easy for you if you use these kind of animations to check if the is reduced motion enabled, and if it is, you're just gonna like cut your animation short. So these are the other checks, and they're available in either the header files or the Apple documentation. So this is super easy to support as well. Design considerations. So we are all developers here in the room, and I expect that there's only a few designers here. But as developers, we have to support our designers in making the right decision. So what are some decisions that we should look at as designers, or as developers to convey to our designers? If we have large text, we need a certain contrast ratio for people that are either colorblind, they have low vision, or some kind of like impairment, visual impairment. And if we have large text, the text should be at least a 3:1 contrast ratio. Now if we have regular text, it should be 4.5:1, or as the human interface guideline, Apple's human interface guideline prefers, 7:1. Now the question is, what is this guy talking about, contrast ratio? How do I calculate that? Well, there's plenty of tools online. So there's either this tool that you can find at contrast-ratio.com, where you can put in your colors and relatively easy get like which accessibility needs you're already fulfilling with the current ratio that you're having. Or you can easily go online there and upload a screenshot at the same homepage, or there's several different tools that are available that calculate the contrast ratio for you in your text fields. So this is super easy too. And nowadays everybody is going to design for dark modes, and dark modes are really great. I love dark modes. I can't wait. After this talk I'm going to install Mojave and finally have my dark mode too. But when you do these kind of things, there's especially the probability for a male person to become colorblind is 5 times bigger for a female. So we have a huge number of the population, and especially our users, that are colorblind. And this is most of the time red-green color blindness. If you look at the iOS activity app, for example, if you look at the left-hand side, it's without being colorblind, and the right-hand side simulates color blindness. Apple does a really good job simulate that, and we're going to see that in a second in how to test. But always when you're using for dark mode, especially dark mode, try to simulate color blindness, as your color choice could be the meaning between 0 and 1, literally, like between seeing something and like conveying information or not. And last but not least, the tap target should always be 44.44 point. So in this case, we have a tap target that is 44 times 44 at least. On the right hand side, we don't. So the difference here between here is that we have a lot of other tap targets that makes this tap target smaller, while this one is bigger. So make it at least 44 times 44 and never communicate information only through icons. So often I see a wrench or a gear as a setting symbol, and when you go over it with the accessibility label, it says image. And you're like, oh great, image, like what does it convey to me? So we've seen all these technology were relatively easy, and it really only needs some input and some love over time, something that you need to integrate into your development cycle, and even more so in your testing cycle. So we want to talk about how to test these accessibility features. I want to show you how to use VoiceOver. I want to specifically show you the accessibility inspector that comes with Xcode, and give you the top 5 tests that you should do every time you're testing your app. So first of all, how do we turn on the VoiceOver? So there's 2 relatively easy things you can do. If you go to General, go to Settings, and then Accessibility. If you scroll all the way down, there's Accessibility Shortcut, as depicted here. And the first option that you're getting is VoiceOver. If you click that option, you haven't turned on the VoiceOver yet, but you've put it on your accessibility shortcut. Now, if you have an iPhone X, you can 3 times press the side button and VoiceOver will be turned on. So tap, tap, tap. And VoiceOver is on. And starts reading the screen the way we defined it, or in this case, the way Apple defined it. Now, if we tap it 3 times again, VoiceOver is off again. If you don't want to do the shortcut, which I only can encourage you to do the shortcut because it's relatively easy to turn it on and off, you can also set it on the first row, or the first row of the accessibility tab. Now once we're in VoiceOver, I already mentioned navigation is going to be totally different, because after all, blind people or people with low vision wouldn't see the screen the way we do. So how do we get around once we have VoiceOver turned on? The first thing is, the selection is always what the triangle or the current square shows you. Now if you swipe to left or right, you're going to the next element that is an accessible element. This goes back to the UI accessibility protocol that I've mentioned before. If this accessibility element is turned on, it will be an accessibility element that VoiceOver can navigate to. Now if you do a double tap with one finger, the current selection will be triggered. So if you're on a button, left or right, it will be triggered. Now, if you're swiping your one finger up from down the screen, up until you feel the first haptic feedback, it will be go as you push the home button. If you go further in the same motion and hear it twice, or feel twice the haptic feedback, you get the app switcher. If you do a C with two fingers, a C finger shape, you're going to do the perform escape, as I mentioned before. And if you do a circle motion with two fingers, you're setting the rotor. And once you set the rotor, you can go up and down with one finger to actually increase or decrease whatever the rotor is set to. This would be, for example, one of the custom actions that you implemented that I showed earlier. Now all of this sounds nice, but I cannot imagine you're doing that with a blindfolded. I cannot imagine you're sitting in your office and doing that blindfolded, but we have other tools for that. There's VoiceOver without cheating for us. I want to call it that. There's something called Screen Curtain that will, one, dramatically increase your battery life, and two, give you the same environment as someone with accessibility needs would have. I'm going to show that to you. If you do a triple tap with 3 fingers.
VoiceOver on. Settings. Double tap to open. Screen curtain on.
Your screen curtain will come on, your battery life increases, and you can start testing.
Screen curtain off.
So whenever you're doing any kind of VoiceOver testing, I can only recommend you to the warmest.
VoiceOver on. Settings.
To actually set the screen curtain on and do that. Because that is the only way for you to actually navigate without looking at it. And this is really important. I see so many people doing VoiceOver testing. They're like, yeah, there's like the banner to get out of, or there's the X in the top left corner that's going to appear 5 seconds after the ad showed. And I'm just going to click on that with VoiceOver and it's going to be fine. I'm like, yeah, but how do you convey 5 seconds pause to someone that doesn't see the screen? And this is the way for you to do it, because if you can't like exit out of your advertisement at the end of the day, the VoiceOver user probably can't either, and like your app has failed at that point. One other tool to do an audit is the accessibility inspector that comes with Xcode. It lets you inspect accessibility elements. It shows you custom actions that you defined. It helps you to turn on and off certain accessibility modes, from inverted color, reduced transparency, reduced motion, to set the dynamic font at any given time so you can actually test if you fully support it. It works beautifully with an IS simulator, and it has even an automated audit. So if you go to the second tab here and click the Run Audit, it will go through a static set of rules that Apple defined for accessibility needs and accessibility inspector. Now be careful with the audit. Like, these are static rules. So sometimes it will show you several things, as like, for example, I have a warning here that one of my tab area is too small, the hit area is too small. This is not always true, as it is seen differently and perceived differently. So you can use this as a guideline, but don't use it as your last tool. Manual testing is still the best testing for VoiceOver. I couldn't find, or for any accessibility needs. I couldn't find a framework. There are 2 free Google frameworks that use it with UI testing, but they do not much different testing than this. So what are my top 5 tests that I want to give you? When you do your testing, always think if you can hear every image that conveys information. Like I mentioned, the gear or the wrench, this, like when it shows a setting and it doesn't convey the information accessibility, this wouldn't pass. Can you hear all the text? Sometimes we set a label, we change the value in the background, we still have the old accessibility label, and you convey different kind of information. Is every view on every view controller accessible? That's the one example that I mentioned with the advertisement. So often I see people that are like, oh yeah, I just have to look here real quick and put the screen curtain back on. That's not going to help you at all. If you cannot navigate or actually set up an account with your app, when the screen curtain turned on, the accessibility user can't either. Is every action tappable? Like the accessibility element is sometimes turned off by default on certain UI kit elements, but it still conveys information or has some kind of a target for you. So make sure these are turned on. And are you displaying all information with extra large dynamic type? The IS-12 beta has been notoriously bad at that. If we looked at the IS-12 beta and like actually turn that on and turn dynamic type to extra large or even 2 times extra large, we wouldn't see all information because it was clipping off, so don't do that. But now I want to show you great examples for accessibility. One of the things that I love in accessibility is Duolingo. Duolingo uses attributed strings to provide voiceover language changes and automatically changes the voiceover language for you. I want to show you that too. This is Portuguese, by the way. So you see, voiceover automatically changed the language because they're using attributed strings the way they injected, and they determine the language, or they actually injected with the attributed string the language, and voiceover will automatically know that. This is pretty great in my opinion because you're enabling a whole bunch of users to learn the language, and you're taking barriers away to learn a new language. Another app, and most of the Apple apps these days are perfectly done in accessibility or near perfect. Another app is the Health app. The Health app is very well known for having all kinds of graphs and UI views that are custom. And this is one thing that the UI accessibility container is very well made for. If you're making your app accessible, and even though you have custom views. In this case, we have a graph and we have different kinds of views that convey information only through images, and they still make it accessible. This is how it looks like for VoiceOver.
Week, month, button, year, previous week, button, August 19 to 26, 2018, button, next week, dimmed, button, heart rate, 49 to 173 BPM, August 19 to 26, 2018, selected, resting rate, 53 to 66 BPM, August 19, August 192018, 61 BPM, August 202018, 59 BPM, August 212.
So we've seen, like, this is a graphing custom container that looks like one element to us, and we are reading the information from there. But they're using several instances that are within each other on UI accessibility container to still convey the information and give the voiceover user the same amount of information that we get, which is pretty awesome. Now, I've talked about like looking outside the box, and one thing that motivated me doing this talk is like, how would you make a map or some kind of navigation system accessible to a voiceover user, to someone that's blind or someone that needs a different kind of input than looking at a map? After all, it's a map. Like, it's something that visually represents information to us. And Apple Maps does it really great. Now, there's two things here that I want to like point out again. Like, there's the UI accessibility container again that is being used in a different way. We see the whole target button here as one element that is being represented as such. But this doesn't help us in understanding information. But now imagine you have the screen curtain turned on and you're searching for, you know that you want to go to the next McDonald's or something like that, and you have different kinds of selections you can do. How would you get the information that you're actually having to turn left where you are now? Well, I give you that, Apple Watch. So if you ever navigated with Apple Watch and Apple Maps together, there is haptic feedback. So when we're talking about the technologies that we have today and the voiceover technology, and talking about accessibility labels, always try thinking outside the box. I'm currently developing a bus routing app that uses a lot of MK map views, right? Or that uses an MK map view and conveys information mostly visual. But if you have a companion app on the Apple Watch, you can actually give haptic feedback on when the next bus is coming, or whatever bus is currently coming, or some kind of notification system. You have a different way of conveying information too. So whenever you're talking about accessibility or implementing accessibility, try to think of what other way of communicating information is there. Last but not least, we come to the conclusion. We're almost at an end, and I want to give you at least 4 or 5 points that you take away from this. So if you've slept all the way through my talk, this is what I want to give you today. Test your app without cheating. So it is relatively easy for us, like clicking this one button. I tried to make this very, very clear with my examples. I was never clicking a button that I only saw. So always try to use screen curtain, do it blindfolded, and do that more often. Put it into your testing cycle. For example, the Duolingo app, they recently screwed that in a recent update, noticed it a day later, and put it in. So I'm pretty sure they have that in their testing cycle. If you can't use it with accessibility features, no one can. I found the perception to be very true amongst developers that like, I'm only using VoiceOver like twice every month, so I'm pretty sure like the blind person can do that because he's relying on it every day. No, like if you can't do that, no one can. Test for large dynamic type and contrast ratio. This is one of the most important things. So often I see like, oh yeah, we want like 17 point there, and we want it to be regular amongst white background, and like if you're colorblind, which many people are, there's a relatively large percentage of people that is colorblind, make this bold and make it different colors. Test for color contrast ratio. There's nothing more convincing to a designer than showing that they don't meet any kind of standard. Test for large and dynamic, I did that already, sorry. Caption icons and images that convey information. Like I said, the wrench, the gear symbol is the best example ever. Like, this is so often only an image and doesn't have an accessibility label. How would you get there? Don't let custom UI elements or complex interfaces stop you from communicating the information to everyone. The topic of this talk is development for all the people. And this is what I want to give you. Design for everyone. I showed you with the XKCD comic that this is something that everybody profits from. This is something that we, like the XKCD voiceover version, communicated something to us that we might have missed. So Apple had a very, very recent change. They went from inclusive design to design for everyone. And I think this is the truest thing that I can give you. This accessibility design is for everyone. I hope you all learned something today. If you have any questions about accessibility, please find me, or take a photo of my wallet pass that the idea I stole from Tom Harr a few years ago. It will automatically give you my wallet pass too, and you can get into contact with me. And if you're an Android developer that does Kotlin, talk to me too. See you.